Great. So I'm going to go ahead and get started. First of all, I want to thank Sachin and all the organizers for doing an amazing job with what looks like it's going to be a fantastic event. It's a beautiful San Francisco day here out in Presidio. Gorgeous venue. Really excited to be here. I'm Yana Welinder. I head up products at IFT, where we're working to unlock remarkable experiences by connecting services. That could be anything from getting users to open their garage door automatically when they come home, or being able to tell Alexa to turn on your Roomba. Really, anytime you're trying to connect to services and have a really seamless experience. From B2B perspective, we're empowering businesses to offer richer experiences to their users. And that's sort of connected to my own personal passion, which is to solve core everyday problems with incredibly simple UI. And there's no way to know if you're actually solving anyone's problems without doing customer research. So that's what I'm going to talk about today, specifically kind of the tricky art of doing B2B customer research. So why do customer research? Right? Asked no one ever, or at least not anymore. So who here is in product? Okay, so a whole lot of folks. So I don't necessarily need to tell you that doing customer research is really key to save time, resources, and your team's morale developing something that no one ultimately wants to buy, or that customer research helps you with having that flexibility to figure out what the right solution is, instead of kind of playing catch up with your competitors. So if it's so important and key for product development, why don't people always do it in B2B situations? It is just more tricky than doing B2C customer research. So I'll talk a little bit about why it's more tricky, and then talk about some ways to get around that. So the first kind of issue with B2B customer research is that it's really not just a product team project. Unlike with B2C research, where you can really figure out your own channels for that. You can do in-product surveys. You can follow up on those surveys with interviews. You can reach out to folks on social media. You can talk with friends who kind of fit the target persona. With B2B, you really have to do kind of cross-functional collaboration and team up with your sales team, your business development team, your customer success team, to ultimately set you up with the right people to talk with. And then sometimes you're not actually going to have the opportunity to talk with your customers directly. In those cases, I try to figure out ways to parse the feedback I get from the customer-facing folks in my organization to be able to tell what are the actual customer needs in that situation. So I'll ask about things like who was the customer, what sort of context did the feedback come up in, what's their use cases, that kind of stuff. And then usually it's not going to be a whole lot of information, but it's going to be enough to get me started in building up personas that I can then use to create, to kind of take next steps in my research. And then, in addition to setting you up with the right people, sales can also be helpful in just kind of managing that relationship and setting up the customer for the conversation. So there's really nothing more frustrating than having figured out who the right customer is, get on the phone with that customer, just to have them tell you that they can't tell you anything about what they do. They can't tell you anything about how they plan to use your product. That really sucks when you get to that point. Nothing more frustrating than hitting a confidentiality wall. So your sales manager can reach out to the customer ahead of time, make sure they've signed the appropriate NDA to be able to answer the type of questions you're interested in asking the customer. And then they can get the customer comfortable talking with you by having sort of an appropriate introduction. So it may seem like a minor point, but it's actually kind of something you come across quite often. So I'm super fortunate to work with an amazing sales team at IFT. They really understand the value of targeted product development and what kind of information I need for that. But from previous experiences, both for myself and with talking with my counterparts at other companies, I know that collaborating with sales can be kind of one of the sticky points in doing B2B research. And it's quite natural. So sales teams will sometimes try to sell things or close a deal with things that are not necessarily on your roadmap. Anyone had that experience? Yep, quite common. And then you come in and you provide all this clarity about what's actually on the roadmap, and obviously they're going to be nervous about that. Or you could have a situation where actually, if you're telling all the right things are on the roadmap, and the customer gets so excited about the things that will come that they wouldn't want to close a deal. Then they would just want to wait until the thing launches next year, right? So for all those reasons, sales are naturally kind of nervous about customer research. One way to try to get around that is to try to avoid prospectives altogether. So you talk with customers who are not in the moment where they're going to be evaluating your product offering, and they're also not close to kind of that renewal cycle. That's a kind of a good time to talk with customers. Obviously, that's not necessarily going to work if you're just starting out and you don't have a whole lot of customers. So you have to talk with prospectives, or you're going to be shifting focus to a new market segment. You don't have the right kind of customers, and you want to talk with prospective customers because they're the ones you're going to be interested in. In any event, whether you're talking with prospectives or your existing customers, you want to get sales comfortable with what you're going to do. So don't try to get into a one-on-one situation with the customer and tell your sales manager or customer representative that to not join the conversation. Instead, try to get them to see you in action. I found that it's really helpful to catch up with sales ahead of time, ask them about any kind of sensitivities that the customer may have, share my questions ahead of time, have them provide feedback on the questions. Is there anything here that you think may be problematic? Ideally, if you're asking the right kind of questions, and I'll talk a little bit about what those questions are in a moment, you're never really going to get to the point where you're exposing the gaps in your product offering, because you're not going to be asking specifically, based off of my product, what are the things you need? You'll be asking slightly different types of questions. And then you never want to outsource the customer interview to someone who may not be mindful of the customer relationship. I've done that mistake. I've outsourced a customer interview once to a design consultant who ended up pushing on the customer too much, and the customer kind of wasn't happy about that, and sales had to step in and try to mend the relationship. So learn from my mistake. Don't do that. And then what happens if your customer-facing folks or sales asks you to join a conversation or a visit when the customer is in town, but won't let you do a proper kind of customer interview? Should you join that? Yes, do it. Do it. So I usually try to jump on every opportunity to talk with customers. I think PMs can sometimes be a little bit kind of hesitant about that, because it's not your responsibility to pitch and sell, and you want to save your time to the most impactful moments where you really get to ask the right kind of questions. And customer interviews, like the really targeted ones, will be most impactful, but they're just fewer of those opportunities. And so forgoing moments where you can ask a few tactful questions here and there, but generally just carefully listening in and catching moments of insightful moments from the customers is going to be helpful too. So I would definitely do it. And then if you absolutely can't collaborate with your sales team, try to get around them, right? Sign up for industry conferences, or where you can kind of just talk with folks informally. Reach out to friends of friends of friends of friends on LinkedIn. It's going to feel awkward to be reaching out to random people, but ultimately you can get really useful information out of that, and essentially just creating a better network for yourself. So usually it's just a win-win situation. Okay, so I have this picture on the slide because trying to figure out who to talk with or doing B2B customer research oftentimes feels like playing with nesting dolls, right? You talk with one customer only to discover halfway through the conversation that you really need to talk with a whole different part of the org. And it's really not that you could have just skipped the first person and just talk with the second person. There's so many different stakeholders that you need to satisfy that you really want to talk with all those people. So obviously, the most important person to talk with and get requirements from is the user. If you're not satisfying the user, the company's never going to sign up and pay, and they're absolutely never going to renew, right? Because by then they will have tried it out and realized that the product doesn't really do what they want it to do. And then there's a few other interesting stakeholders in B2B, right? So there's the buyer, there's the contract approvers. Legal and finance will have lots of interesting requirements that you need to satisfy as well. IT teams will have a lot of requirements on SaaS B2B offerings. So you'll need to make sure you get those folks checking off their checklists without creating sort of a Frankenstein's monster product. So that's going to be important. And you really just want to figure out what is the list of different stakeholders I want to talk with in this particular company and give that list over to sales, try to set you up with all those people, and that can be your starting point. And then don't get frustrated that you get kicked around in the company and get to talk with more people. Usually just a good thing. So there's a ton of preparation that goes into a customer interview. It's not just kind of getting on the phone and chatting, though sometimes it may feel like that's what you're actually doing when you're in the moment. So the things you want to look into is obviously like who's your ideal customer, so you know who to ask questions to. What's the general problem that your product can be solving for them? Like what substance do you want to talk about? Researching market trends just to understand where your product fits into the market is going to be important. And then your competitors, right? So it's not just going to be who is specifically competing against your company, but what are some of the competing types of solutions out there? So like if I were a PM for Skype, I wouldn't just care about Google Hangouts, I would also care about just the use of the telephone. Like what are all the different uses around that? And I would want to kind of think about that as much as possible before I go into an interview. And then you want to learn about the customer, right? Like what do they do? What products do they have? What things have they released recently? You want to learn about their competitors. Learning about their competitors, for me, usually I know what my customer is looking to do, what's on their roadmap, by looking at what their competitors have in their product. So if I see that a certain type of customers have a particular type of IoT integrations in their products, I know to ask about those kind of integrations to the customer I'm talking with. And then you want to use their products as much as possible, just to kind of inform your questions and be able to ask better questions and have some context for that. I have a ton of IoT devices at home just to be able to try out all the different things. So if you look at my my phone, I've downloaded a crazy amount of like apps that I'll never use in the future, but I used in preparation for customer interviews. That's kind of a helpful thing to do, both in terms of being able to ask better questions, but also to signal to the customer that you really care. You really care about making them successful. That makes them open up and tell you much better information in the interview. So it's sort of like more of a psychology trick, I guess. And then once you have all of that information, you want to form personas based off of both kind of the company and what they do, and also the individual you're going to be talking with, their role at the company. And with those personas, you can usually formulate better questions. So I try to have a combination of super general questions like, what does your normal day look like? And then very specific questions like, how many browser tabs can you handle before you go crazy, right? And then I try to write down all the questions that I can think of in this super long list of questions. As you can probably tell from my weird Swedish accent, I'm from San Francisco. No, I've lived in San Francisco for a while. But English is not my first language. So I try to write out every question that I have so that I can make sure I can get it right. But I think that actually applies even beyond that for native speakers. You want to write out every question and make sure that you think through what are the possible ways the customer could interpret that question in, right? There's a lot of different ways that could go. And then I prepare a super long list of questions, and then I'm prepared to just put that list of questions aside and not use it at all if the conversation goes in a different direction, which it surprisingly often does in B2B customer research, because you have sales in the room, and they will ask questions, and they will try to pitch, and there's going to be a whole lot of that going on, and you're not going to have as much control over the conversation as you would in a kind of traditional customer interview. So be prepared to do that. I find that it's helpful to just group questions very tactically by topics, so that when the conversation does go in a different direction, I can sort of skim my topics and figure out, is there anything I can kind of still dive into based off of the things that we've just discussed with the customer. So ideally, I want to bring no one. I want to go to a customer interview and have a one-on-one conversation. If I bring folks from my company, the customer will want to bring someone from their company, and we'll be in a group setting, and everyone's going to say things to impress each other, which is not at all what I want. I want customers to be as honest as possible and as open as possible and tell me everything about their needs, right? So ideally, you really want to have, if you could, you'd have a one-on-one conversation. Having said that, sales will often want to join because they put you in touch with this person. They have the responsibility of tracking all the things the customer is going to ask you about and follow up on those conversations. So that kind of makes sense, and you don't want to exclude them from the conversation. You really want to make sure that they feel comfortable about what you're doing. But it usually, if you have a good relationship with sales, it usually shouldn't be too disruptive, or it has, in my experience, hasn't been too disruptive, unless they kind of steal the show and don't let you ask any questions, which does also happen. So the other type of person you may want to bring to the conversation is sometimes there's going to be folks who have particular types of expertise that you may want to bring. I will often bring one of my engineers when we're talking about kind of some of the future APIs and the customer is represented by one of their engineers. It's just helpful to have an API engineer in the room for that kind of conversation. Interestingly, I found that sales are somewhat uncomfortable when PMs bring engineers or designers. In certain contexts, there's this stereotype that they may ask less, they can be less tactful in how they ask questions and may kind of expose your gaps more. Obviously, it depends on the person, depends on their stereotypes. There's just some of the most thoughtful engineers out there who will just be able to maneuver a conversation in an amazing way. But just be mindful of who you bring and try to keep the participants to a minimal. Okay, so the kind of questions that I want to ask, I want to uncover as much detail as possible about how the customer will use my product or an equivalent solution, and really get a full picture so that I can understand their needs. If my product were a tool that they would use in their day-to-day, I'd want to ask as much as possible about just what happens during their day. If it's a product, which is the situation in my case, where they're going to be incorporating it in their product, I want to ask about when they've previously done that. So, like, what were the different steps for creating an integration? What were some of the pain points during each step? How long did each step take? Why did you do things in certain ways? That kind of things. It may seem silly, but I find it helpful to ask the same question multiple times in different ways. It just forces the customer to think about what they just heard in a different way, and they may kind of essentially answer the question in the same way, but add a little bit more detail or a little bit more nuance, and you kind of get a fuller picture that way. And then one kind of somewhat controversial thing is site visits. A lot of PMs say that you absolutely have to go and visit the customer and watch them in action. And that's true for a lot of products. So if your product is a tool that they're going to be using in their day-to-day, you really want to go there, sit next to them, see what their work setup is, what hardware and software they use, kind of how they move their arms. I don't know. You want to do all those things. You don't necessarily need that for a lot of other products where they're not actually going to be using it in their day-to-day. So traveling to exotic destinations may kind of just distract you from talking with more customers. So just something to keep in mind. So after asking a ton of those kind of open-ended questions where I just try to get the customer telling me as much as possible, I'll try asking a different type of question, which is usually kind of assumptions that I formulated about their needs based off of the personas that I prepared ahead of time, or the kind of the information that they've given me up to that point. Sometimes that point in questioning comes really early if customers aren't great at responding to open-ended questions. So you may kind of jump to this step much faster in the process. And then usually the reaction will be to confirm or deny my assumptions, right? I found that when my assumptions are slightly wrong, that's when I get the most useful information out of the interview, because customers will try to course correct me. In the process of course correcting me, they will say a ton of things about kind of details about how they're going to be using my product. And then the other thing is that when I am slightly wrong, not so wrong that they feel like this is hopeless, I don't want to talk with this person, right? But just slightly wrong, they feel like they're more knowledgeable than me, and they want to share their wisdom. And so kind of just like from a natural kind of human nature perspective, you really just want to teach. And that's the mode they get into, and then they can give you more useful information as well. I usually try to save my pitch or my kind of product demo for a follow-up call. Sales or the customer may get really annoyed with me that I'm wasting the customer's patience not pitching the product. So it helps to tell them ahead of time what I'm doing. I'm going to share the pitch in a follow-up call. Don't worry, it's coming. Now we need to talk about kind of what your needs are. I find that I get a little bit more slack if I promise to incorporate the information I uncover during the first call in my demo in the follow-up call, and then obviously have to follow through on that promise. Sometimes, though, the product you're talking about is so abstract that it's really difficult to get useful information without some sort of demo to the customer. Some of our APIs are that way. And so in those situations, I find it useful to just formulate use cases that the customers can interact with. Usually those use cases work in the same way as kind of presenting assumptions. Customers can sort of confirm or deny what you have on the slide and kind of slightly change how the flow would go or some of those things. It also helps them to uncover some of the kind of very specific needs that they have, like, this part of the flow needs to be logged for IT. That part of the flow absolutely cannot because we're in Germany and there's, no, that's a no-go or something, right? Or this part of the product needs to be white labeled. I don't care about that part. You can brand it with your brand all you want. So those kind of specifics are difficult to get to without actually having a demo. And then sometimes I do all these things and talk with a ton of customers and don't really get to really useful information. And I talked to this one customer who's just amazing. They tell me everything. Everything about their needs, about their pain points. I get super clear priorities. It is so incredibly tempting to take all of those priorities and run with them. Don't do it. Don't build for just one customer, right? So if you get that really strong signal from one customer, you really want to validate that with multiple customers. So usually what I try to do is to set up interviews after that point and use the strong signal or the information I got from one customer to set up assumptions or kind of use cases that I can present to more customers, and they can pick those apart and give me a much more nuanced view of what we need to build. I also found that it's actually easier to formulate better surveys after you've spoken with a ton of customers, because you know how customers are likely to kind of misunderstand questions or take questions in a certain direction, so you can formulate something that will get you to the core much easier based off of interviews you've already had. You know, you never want to feel like you know everything about one customer's needs, right? I think it's kind of tempting to have a list of customers and then talk with each of them and then just cross them off the list and feel like, oh, I know what they need. But actually, customers' needs will evolve over time as they have to do different tasks or are introduced to new technologies, and that over time can be literally like next week, right? I usually try to talk with customers periodically. It helps to also be able to tell customers how the things I've learned from a previous conversation got incorporated into the product. That makes them feel like they're being listened to. The conversation is worthwhile. It's not just a waste of their time. So that's something to try to do if possible. Okay, so I did say 10 simple steps, maybe not that simple, but hopefully if all you came away with from today, I think these are kind of the most important things, I think. So you want to collaborate with your gatekeepers, with your customer-facing folks. You want to kind of, both in terms of having them connect you with the right people, but also set the conversation up for success. Take every opportunity to talk with customers, and if you can't do it through the folks in your org, just cleverly get around them and try to do it anyway. You want to do as open-ended questions as possible, ask them in a tactful way, and listen and save your pitch for another day. This is not about pitching your product, though that is oftentimes what customers are looking for you to do. And then you want to talk with customers periodically. So this is not just a one-time thing. You want to see what their latest needs are over time. Cool. So I think I am right on time. So not sure if we have time for questions. But if we do, let's ask them now. Yeah. I wonder if this mic on?
Cool. So thanks, by the way. Great talk. On your point number 3, the nesting dolls, I've found that to be extremely important as well. Sometimes talking to sort of a manager on the other side can give a misleading signal. But talking to the end user is just a totally different game.
Yeah.
What are some tactics you've seen or you've used yourself that actually let you get past the fear of wasting the manager's employees' time and getting that really good feedback?
Yeah. So I mean, a lot of in my experience, I don't feel like there's ever anyone who you shouldn't talk with. If someone is sort of the first nesting doll in the conversation, you can actually uncover a lot about needs, even if there is kind of a direct report who would be interacting with the product much more directly. So I would say talk with all of them without kind of skipping the manager. If there's absolutely nothing to learn from the manager, I think just being open about that to the manager is fine. Kind of explain it to them from the perspective of, you want your employees to be as productive as possible. I want to talk with the people who will be using the product the most. Who would that be? Is there someone on your team who is particularly good at providing really good feedback? Get them to be kind of partner up with you and feel like they're being productive too. Yeah. Yes. Do you want to? I wonder if we want to send around the microphone or.
Could you just talk a little bit about how to do research on your direct competitor other than going through the customer route? Yeah, so your direct competitor or the customer's competitor? Your direct competitor. Your direct competitor. So there's a ton of research you can do just online in terms of figuring out what are they offering now and what are they talking about in
like conference settings and things like that. But I think talking with the customer is going to be really important because oftentimes someone will have pitched things to them, and they will have, like, even if they can't tell you this company does X thing, the way they're thinking about your product is going to be biased by what they've heard. So a lot of the things they will be asking about, like, can your product do X, right, will tell you a lot about what they've heard from your competitors. Other questions? Yes?
So how does your team collate all this interview research and then inform the product?
Yeah, so good question. So the question is how do you gather all of this information and actually get it to inform the product? I think it's always a tricky piece to figure out how much time do you want to spend like documenting things and get it in a way that's actually like actionable, right? I found that I don't want to just like take my notes and give them to the engineers. That's always a bad idea. But try to like get the most important piece out of each conversation and see, is there a way I can inform the engineers? I will like literally get on Slack after each interview and like write 3 bullet points. What was like my most important things that I think my team really needs to know? And then later on, you can kind of think about how do I consolidate all of these different things across the different orgs, different customers that I've talked with. But just in that moment in time, you can be like, oh, this customer asked the same thing as these other 3 customers that I've just talked with. You want to know that. Other questions? Cool. I am going to be around during the break, so feel free to reach out to me then as well. Just wanted to mention that we're hiring. So if you or someone you know is interested in IFT, ping me either via email or on Twitter. Thank you.